Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you are in the world, and welcome to this DevOps.com workshop, brought to you by Techstrong and Oak9. My name is Cody J. Brown. I'm the host of Techstrong Learning, and we have an exciting program for you ahead. First, I do have a couple of housekeeping notes. This session is being recorded, so if you miss any of our discussion, or you'd like to rewatch or share with a friend, the on-demand recording will be made available shortly after we conclude our live session today. If you have any questions, we want you to send those in to us using the Q&A tab, which you'll find on the right side of your screen. Over on the right side of the screen is where you'll also find the chat tab, and that's where we want you to get to know your fellow audience members. Let us know your thoughts throughout today's program, or maybe just let us know from where you are tuning in. We've got a couple of polls that will be launched throughout today's program, so keep an eye out for those as we do want your participation. And if you check out the Handouts tab, you'll find two handouts there available for you to download to aid with today's program. And of course, before we close out, we are giving out 4 $25 Amazon gift cards, so be sure to stick around. So the title of this program is Best Practices for Writing Secure Terraform, and I'm joined by Om Vyas, Chief Product Officer and co-founder at Oak9, and Ramesh Patel, Director of Cloud and DevOps at Oak9. So Om, Ramesh, thank you both so much for joining me. Om, why don't you take it away from here?
Yeah, thanks, Cody. Thanks for having us, and really great to do this webinar and this writing secure Terraform alongside DevOps.com and Techstrong. I'll quickly introduce myself. As Cody mentioned, Om Vyas. I'm Chief Product Officer and co-founder at Oak9. My background is software engineering, built many products and software for a lot of Fortune 500 companies. Have built DevOps practices and cloud practices along the way. And, what Oak9 does is we, as the slide here is sharing, we want to make cloud infrastructure security easy for developers, which is very appropriate for what we're going to talk about today. I'm going to quickly hand it off to my colleague, Ramesh Patel, to introduce himself, and then we'll get started.
Thank you, Cody, and thank you, Om. I hope everyone enjoys the webinar today. We have a good one. Again, my name is Ramesh. I'm the Director of Cloud and DevOps here at Oak9, dealing with many of the development tool sets that we use in-house and making sure that our AWS infrastructure is resilient and scalable.
Awesome. Thanks, Ramesh, for that introduction. So, we're gonna get started. This is gonna be a very interactive session. My goal is not to bore you all with a ton of PowerPoint slides. So literally have 2 PowerPoint slides today. So we can get started. Really, in terms of the agenda, what we want to do is really build a live example of Terraform code that will deploy a microservice, set of microservices in AWS. We are going to test out that it's working. And then really our focus for the remainder of the time is to think and talk about how do you really ensure that your Terraform that you're developing, the workloads that you're building are secure and compliant. So let's get started. I mean, before we jump in, what I would love to really understand is there are a lot of great people on the audience. Would love to understand what are your Terraform expertise. Will really help us tailor the conversation today. So if you don't mind taking a quick poll, and we'll get started. All right.
Okay, we got a good turnout here, Om.
Yeah, looks like a great turnout. Looks like fairly diverse audience, but majority fairly comfortable with building Terraform. So we'll keep this technical, and I like to make these as interactive as possible. So if you have any questions that you think of, please add them to the Q&A tab, or you can just chat the questions, and Ramesh and Cody will help us call them out, and we'll try to answer them as we go along. And don't be shy, jump in. So let's get started. So first thing we want to do is let's actually build out a microservices example, and we're going to use some native capabilities from AWS to do that, along with Terraform. So let me share my screen, and please let me know if it is my IDE is not readable or the Terraform is not readable. Then I can adjust my font settings. So if everything looks good, we can get started. So really, the first thing what we've done here is, we're building a simple users API, right? So the API has two methods that are built using API Gateway from AWS, and we have built some code in Python that really stores some user data and then enables a GET request to come through to be able to retrieve that user data, right? So some of the components that we've built and then were used today, for example, are DynamoDB, API Gateway to receive the requests, DynamoDB to store our data that we're going to store as part of the post request. As I mentioned, we're going to use serverless functions, Lambda on AWS, to actually process those requests, and then some S3 buckets to host the deployment contents of our app bundles here. So let's take a look at some of our Terraform code that we've built firsthand. We'll start with our API Gateway, right? So this is seems like you're all very familiar audience with how Terraform is structured. We've created a gateway resource here, and this gateway resource is really just the API edge that will enable any requests from over the internet to connect to our backend, right? So we've set up a staging environment on that gateway. We want to make sure that we have some routes that we support. So we will have a get user route here, which is our get request. And we have our post method, which will actually add that user data in our code base or in our data store. And then some additional resources around API Gateway integrations to set up the correct proxy. And then we have everything abstracted out through our variables on the API Gateway side. Ramesh, anything to add on our API Gateway composition?
I think you pretty much nailed it, Om. I think this is a typical design for many of the DevOps folks out there. You have a nicely designed module structure, and then you're using the root main.tf to pull in those modules. So it looks pretty clean to me.
Awesome. So I'll quickly walk through some of the other components in this architecture, right? So we have our DynamoDB table, as I mentioned, pretty standard. And a lot of these resources that I'm building are fairly are really using kind of the minimum required attributes and components for these Terraform resources, right? So this is a pretty Ramesh, would you say this is a pretty typical example of kind of building resources or even potentially extracting these resources or modules from something like a Terraform registry as an example?
Yeah, I would say so. I think in a typical workload where people are designing Terraform files, they usually will go to the documentation and try to pull in the code and snippets, and this is exactly what you would get in the documentation. So,
yep, perfect. And so I have my Lambda set up. So this is a Lambda function, Lambda functions for the set and the get, so the post and the get request. We're setting up some IAM roles here behind the scenes that enable access to Lambda to connect to the API gateway, as well as Lambda to be able to access the read-write access to the DynamoDB table, right? And some additional IAM policies. And then, Last few things are probably less interesting, just some standard Python code that does the store, and then the S3 buckets that house or host the app bundles that Lambdas can use to deploy the code. So we'll get started. So pretty straightforward code. Let's actually go ahead and build this out. And let me do my Terraform init. So hopefully you guys can see the example here. Looks like our init is good.
And while Om's running the Terraform apply, I'm going to go ahead and send out our GitHub link to our repo that Om is using here to do his testing, and so everyone can follow along if they want to.
Right. Seems like okay. It didn't add any resources. Did we forget to destroy ahead of time, Ramesh?
That could be the case. Yeah. We can just go to the cloud and check if the resources are already there and destroy it and run it again.
Yeah, let's do that. Let me share my screen here. So I'm just taking a look. Yeah, it looks like it was already created ahead of time. Let me destroy these resources so we can see it from. All right, so it looks like we were doing some playing around earlier and the resources weren't destroyed. So we'll start over. We'll destroy all the resources. Let's do it, and we will restart. And Ramesh, you were able to share the link to our.
Yep,
Awesome.
I sent the link out.
Okay, so looks like now if we do apply, it should use our latest Terraform to build out the entire workload. And before I hit yes, let me make sure everything got destroyed here. Yep, looks good. So off we go.
So after you hit yes here, we're going to have a simple API in the cloud where we'll be able to make some HTTP curls and add some user details, right, Om?
Yeah, absolutely. We'll actually build the workloads. We'll test it out to make sure we'll test it out to make sure that those API requests are actually working and functioning. So it looks like we're good. We added 19 resources. So I think all set here, and it looks like it outputted a nice base URL for us to play around with our API. So I'm going to switch gears and just double check that indeed everything is live again. Okay. So I have my API gateway here up and running. I have my URL up, and let's look at some integrations. All right. So I have my get user and my set user, so which is my get and the post methods. If we dive in a little deeper, looks like the Lambda functions are deployed, and it should be at this point good to go. And let's maybe look at the DynamoDB to make sure that was provisioned correctly. Let me look at my table. Looks like I have it. And my user table, so I have my correct capacity, and I think it's looking good. So if this should work, so let's test it out, shall we? So let me clear this out, and let me maybe do a get first. And so what I'm doing is just doing a simple curl request using the Terraform output to fetch the base URL. And hopefully this should return nothing, right? Which is the case. And now let's do our post request. And I'm going to, today's the 18th. We'll change the date here to make it today. And let's add a new record using the API. So it seems like a record was added with an ID of 0. If we go back and fetch a record, it should Yep, there we go. So it returns it. So it seems like our API is functioning. And I think what we saw so far here is we built some Terraform. We had built it ahead of time because we only have an hour. We applied our Terraform changes to build the workload, and we tested our APIs. So Ramesh, is that all? Are we done? Is our work done?
I don't know. I mean, we didn't do anything with security. We don't know if this Terraform code is secure yet. But I like to understand from the audience, how they deploy their infrastructure in the cloud before you get into this topic of security.
Yeah, let's do it.
Okay, seems like polls are still coming in, but most folks are starting to use IAC, and some of them also have fully automated pipelines, which is good to know.
Yeah, and I think this is pretty typical with what we're seeing with our customers, right? I think majority of our customers are somewhere in that middle area of they're not only they're starting to use the IAC, or they have some of their workloads from the portfolio of applications of their enterprise, right, in the cloud that are built with Terraform, and then there are a bunch of others that are deployed through ClickOps. So this is I would say pretty in line with and aligned with kind of what we're seeing with our customers as well. So let's bring up the topic. Ramesh, you brought up the topic of security and compliance, right? So what is sort of, I guess, let me ask you a question. I'll put you on the spot and say, how do you actually, as you're writing Terraform code, how do you ensure that Terraform code is secure, right? What are some of the things that you're doing if you're thinking about not only security but also compliance? Let's say, we'll take the example of, we're a healthcare company, and we care about HIPAA and high trust as an example, from a compliance standpoint. So Ramesh, what's your approach? What are you seeing? What are some of the things that you're doing as you build Terraform?
Yeah, so that's a really good question, Om. I think a lot of companies do it differently, right? So if you're a born in the cloud company, and you're using cloud resources, pretty small and nimble, most of the job role or functionality will fall within one group or DevOps group. But if you're like an enterprise level company, I think where they have various departments and groups to allocate this type of responsibility to, then it'll fall into the DevSecOps or a security team, which will work in conjunction with the DevOps team.
Yeah, I mean, I think that makes sense, right? I mean, not all organizations are created equal. Not all applications and workloads and their requirements are created equal, right? Which really brings, which makes this even more interesting and challenging, right? Because, typically what we see, as we talked about, right, is that there are a lot of community-driven modules, or there are, from Terraform registry that often we're pulling, or our customers are pulling. So, if you are, let's say you are born on the cloud company, or you don't have as much of security team or as big of a security team, then the responsibility falls on you. So what are some of the things that, from a best practices standpoint, that we should we think about to really help ensure that this workload that we deployed took us relatively quickly to build and deploy? It's a relatively small code, I'd say a few hundred lines of code. So Ramesh, what happens how do you scale, right? I mean, that seems like the workloads are getting more and more complex. There are many hundreds of thousands of resources that even a relatively small to mid-size application could have. So how do you tackle this if you are a smaller born on the cloud company, or a company that doesn't have as many security practitioners or architects to help you with it.
Yeah, I mean, I think the tool, various organizations will choose the right tool for their requirements and for their use cases. I think in a lot of cases, right, if it's a small organization, they can go with the open source tool. But the thing with an open source tool, right, is that leads to technical debt where someone has to manage it in house, and you have to have a group of resources to keep it up to date. And then if you are a larger organizations and you have 10,000 lines of Terraform code, you obviously can't do an open source tool because the open source tool is not going to have all the functionality and bells and whistles that you need. So in certain cases, then you might go into a managed services route where that product is capable of actually scanning tons of lines of Terraform code.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting, right, that you mentioned, larger organizations that even if they have security architects, right, it doesn't seem like, a security architect or a security engineer is always going to be well versed in Terraform. And, even if they are, right, do they really have the bandwidth to, look at Terraform closely to really understand all the different resources, all the different controls that go into, requirements for the compliance to be, an application to be compliant to those standards, or even looking at the security holistically for these types of complex workloads.
Right. Like in this case that we did right now, right? How do we know that we have encryption at rest and we're secure in transit, or we have network segregation. So all these things you have to kind of keep in mind when you're writing Terraform. If you go and write, and especially when you have many teams that are contributing to the same code base, that code can grow to a large amount. And if you have drift, then you're going to have a major security debt to cover later on if you don't continually apply security vigor to your Terraform code.
Yeah, I mean, that's exactly it, right? Like, I mean, even some of our smaller customers, right? They have, tens of different applications, right? For which they're not able to, scale with the amount of at the rate that not only the code base is growing, right? But it's really around, how fast it's changing, right? From sprint to sprint to, a release cycle, developer or the team changed some feature. They added a new serverless component. I mean, you saw how easy it is to pull in another Lambda module like we have built to say, yep, I'm going to add a new route, or I'm going to add an entirely new microservice that supports additional capabilities. And again, the code is, the code is quickly growing, right? And I think, what I've also observed, right, is that, modules can be great to create abstractions and to quickly build repeatable code. But does that mean that, if you built a module once, that your job is done? And if you validated that it's secure and you've looked at its security, does that mean that, you no longer have to maintain it, or you no longer have to think about the security of that module if you built it once?
Absolutely not, because that module can change under the hood, right? AWS can change their their specifications, and then they can add a new security attribute, and all those have to be caught, right? And someone has to implement those new security practices. Also, when a lot of these modules are getting created in the registry, a lot of people are not keeping your compliance standards or your framework that your company has to follow in mind, right? They're writing these modules with a sense of being able to repeat them and you reuse them. And then the onus is on the individual who's pulling in the module to make sure that those security attributes are in there.
Yeah, I mean, exactly, right. And like, I've seen it in the past as well, right? That like, I think one of the pitfalls of using modules, right, is that, we're all often like left with this impression that like, oh, now I don't have to do anything, right? But there's a lot that goes on. And, it's funny, I was talking to one of the AWS teams, and, they were mentioning how there were 3 days last year where they didn't make changes to, where they didn't deploy any new changes to one of their features or services, right? So even AWS teams are rapidly, changing the features and capabilities, right? So, really staying on top of this is a challenging task, right? And I mean, I know we've done 2 polls, but I think, what's one more? I would love to personally understand, like, what folks on the call today, like, how are you thinking about security and compliance, right? And we'd love to get your thoughts, and then, maybe we'll jump right into then, how do we, after the poll, how do we actually build secure and compliant Terraform code, and what are some of the gotchas that we should be looking for?
While that poll comes in, let's see if there's any questions here that we can answer.
Yeah, I think it seems like there's a question while we're waiting on the poll about, how is this different from, say, Sentinel or Terrascan, or aside from providing a web UI? Yeah, I mean, I think it's a great question, right? And I think it's the right question to ask as a practitioner, right? So, I believe I think the question here is referring to Terraform Sentinel, right? And we're actually a HashiCorp Terraform partner. And Sentinel is very complementary to what we're offering, because really what Sentinel is trying to do is it's really bringing in a language to define your own policies, right? And under the hood, what we're doing and what we're offering, and we'll see this in a few minutes here, is, our goal really is to give you out-of-the-box security capability that enables you as a practitioner, whether you are an SRE or DevSecOps group, or whether you are a large enterprise with a security engineers, to not have to do a lot of the manual legwork to figure out how do you secure your Terraform, right? Oak 9 gives you out-of-the-box security and compliance built in, right? So from that perspective, we're highly complementary to Sentinel. And under the hood, what we call our blueprints, which is our security underpinning, is really, they're defined as code. And you're going to hear a bit more buzz about us later this year, but that security as code is really a bring your own language model that we're going to release, and Sentinel is one of the languages that we'll support. So we're very complementary to Sentinel, to answer that question. And the other part of the question is, well, how are we different from something that's free, like Terrascan, right? So some of what you'll see in our output, and I'll share this with you here, right, is that there are a handful of these tools like Terraform Scan that are out there that are really focused on misconfiguration, right? So the example that I like to think about is, if you are trying to speak a new language and you use a dictionary of keywords like Terrascan is doing, yeah, you're going to identify things like, hey, what's HTTP versus HTTPS? All those things Oak 9 will identify, and to us, that's table stakes, right? But as you saw, that even a relatively simple example that we built, there's an API gateway. API gateway is connecting via an IAM role to a Lambda. That Lambda is talking to DynamoDB table. It has read IAM permissions. It has write permissions. So when you look at holistically about, does that Lambda or is that serverless function, does it have broad access? Does it have privileged access? How are all of these different components are connected and talking to each other? How are they segregated? How are they isolated? And when you factor all that in and you actually look at the requirements of the application, right, that's really a contextualized risk-appropriate security that a lot of those open source tools are not looking at, because they're really focused on static misconfiguration checking, right? So I hope that answers the question that was asked. And I think
there's one more question. Should we answer that one before we go into this poll? Can we write on-prem secure Terraform modules compliant with certain regulations?
Yeah. So I think the answer is yes, absolutely. So if you look at, I think what they're trying to say by on-prem, Ramesh, and you can confirm for me, right, is that they're writing and building their own modules that are not in a Terraform public registry, right? I suppose that's kind of the use case here.
Yeah, it seems like they have their own private registry is what they're leaning towards.
Yeah, so I think, yeah, you absolutely can, right? And one of the things you'll see here, right, is with Oak9, we can integrate directly into your IDE. We can recursively pull down all the modules. So, the example, we gave is actually building the API gateways and DynamoDBs as modules that we're pulling, and I can share that here in a second to kind of better explain how Oak9 is working and supports both of the on-prem modules as well as any modules that may have been used from a public registry like Terraform registry. So it looks like we got our code, and seems like majority of the security responsibility for that Terraform falls under DevOps or cloud teams, right? So this is pretty typical from what we see. So let me share this, right? So I think the example here, let me go back to my screen. So I have my root main module here. And what I've done is we looked at all the resources that we created, and then in our main module, we pulled them all as modules. So these are just local modules that I've created, and then I can use, abstractions, Terraform abstractions to then actually separate out these modules in another repository or what have you. And Oak9 would support those, local or on-prem modules, right? So I know there's a lot of questions around, differentiation, a lot of questions around, supporting modules. So I think it's right time to jump right into how does Oak9 actually do this, all right? Or how can you do this with Oak9? And so let me share my screen here back to our app portal. And so what you really, with any application or workload that you're building in the cloud and you want to secure that with Oak9, it really starts with helping us understand that set of requirements, both around the application itself, but also the compliance or regulatory standards that you're trying to follow. So let's set this up, right? So I'm going to say I am building my users API for DevOps.com. The first thing we want to understand is what's our deployment model, right? Obviously, we built this in AWS, so it's public cloud. We talked about kind of the compliance frameworks that we want to adhere to, and we're going to pick the high trust and HIPAA and stick to kind of our healthcare example that we talked about. But there's many other compliance frameworks that we support, as you see, SOC 2, ISO 27K1. If you're focused on GDPR or PCI DSS, if you're, for example, a fintech company, maybe you're deploying a lot of instances, both in AWS and Azure, where you want to follow CIS controls, or maybe Azure benchmarks or AWS FTR. We can support all of these standards, right? And that's another advantage, right? When you are talking about some of the open source tool, again, they'll do the basic things, right? But then how do you actually bring it all together to say security is one thing, compliance is another thing? How do I get both of them together? And then how do I get them continuously? And then the last couple of questions.
Yeah, that's interesting, Om, because that's interesting, right, Om, because those compliance frameworks have a lot of data mappings on the back end. So to keep up with those on a daily basis is a daunting task. And it seems like you guys are dynamically kind of just doing that in the back end, right?
Yeah, that's exactly what we do, right? We'll keep up to date on all of the changes in these compliance frameworks. We understand that, how these compliance controls or sort of requirements, what do they mean, or how do they translate into the security of that Terraform, right? The security of that infrastructure as code. That's exactly it. And then, the last couple of questions are really, we want to also understand, right, how to, what sorts of data is this application or workload using, right? Is this a business sensitive data store that it's using? In our case, it's DynamoDB, and it's storing user data, so we'll mark it as business sensitive. Then what's the business impact, if the data were to be compromised, or something were to be compromised from where the workload is deployed. And then the last one is, we'll say, hey, this is a public API that's used by our consumer. So once we've answered these 5 questions, right, that really gives Oak9 an understanding to now then dynamically apply those security standards, right, that I talked about earlier, right? We can look at, your network configuration. We can look at how different IAM roles, how different components are interacting. We can look at your data at rest, and we can look at your encryption and data integrity configurations as well. So at this point, it's pretty simple as connecting to, any one of the, integrations that we have available, right? We can integrate into your code repository, we can integrate into your pipeline, but we'll show the CLI example because we want to integrate as early as possible and help be secure and compliant by design, right? So what I've done here is I've created a CLI integration, and so looks like now we're just waiting for the CLI command to run. So I'll copy the command here, and let me paste this back into so let me first actually make sure that our CLI was downloaded correctly here. Let me go into.
So you literally did that in 3 clicks, to build that profile and get a CLI output and an API token out. So
yeah, I think I talked more than the time required to get up. So I think we're good to go. It looks like our CLI is good, and now I have this project that I created, and I will go ahead and apply that command that we got from the So let me copy paste that command in our command line. And here, right, what Oak9 is doing is we're just saying, provide this project or application that you created so we understand, excuse me, what risk profile or how to risk appropriately secure it. And then I just gave it a path to where all of my Terraform is, right, which is this user's API that I just created. And hopefully here, what you should see in, a few seconds is Oak9 will not only start with this main module here that we were looking at, the root module, but it will understand that there are other modules being referenced and where the source of that module is that they're being referenced from. And then it will go to those sources and then recursively keep going until it finds all the resources that are being provisioned, and it will then analyze all of the Terraform that's part of your, not only the resources in the root module, right, but all of the other modules and its resources, right, so that it can figure out completely all of the resources that are available, that are getting provisioned in this workload, and then how are they secure, right? So pretty typical. Now hopefully, let me expand here and minimize this view. What you should see, what we saw here is we ran this command, for this particular project that we had created. We found some critical design gaps, and then we typically like to segment by critical, high, moderate, and low. We don't want to create a lot of noise and a lot of false positives. So really, one of the things that we really focus on is how can we help you address the most egregious things up front, and then as you have time and bandwidth, sprint over sprint, you can tackle the more moderate and low design gaps, as they come. So, maybe we'll jump right in, Ramesh. Like, I think some of the obvious things that I'm seeing, right, is things around like TLS, right? The more of those kind of what we like to think or call table stakes things, right? Hey, is your TLS configured? Is it configured appropriately? So is your data encryption set correctly? So I'm seeing here that our DynamoDB table, obviously we built this with intent, but this is pretty typical, right? Like you forget to set server-side encryption on DynamoDB table. So you want to make sure your data is encrypted at rest. That's the easy one. Your your data is encrypted in transit. But then let's really dive into some of the differentiations that people asked about, right? Which is, some of the interesting use cases that Oak9 will find, like access policy enforcement, or, better understanding authentication and authorization.
Right. I think almost it's going pretty deep into detail here, right? Like it's indicating that your Lambda should be in a private VPC for network segregation, right? And that's a lot. That's something that a lot of people don't take into consideration when they're deploying their Lambda. And it could be a big security risk, right? Because if you have a Lambda that's sharing resources with other things in AWS, you have the potential to have that Lambda leak sensitive information, or you can have other teams have access to your Lambda. So, I think that's useful right there with the Lambda being isolated. And there's some
Yeah.
real good stuff here.
Yeah, I mean, I think, Ramesh, if you think about it, right, like if we are building an application or a set of microservices that maybe are not using sensitive data, right, then maybe they don't need to be isolated, right? And that's one of the things around networking that's often, as you said, right, gets lost, right? And what Oak9 is doing here, right, is we're actually using your Terraform to better understand by applying the answers that you gave us ahead of time when you created the project to say, hey, we understand that you're building a sensitive application that's critical to your business. We want to make sure that when you have serverless functions that have access to non-sensitive data, and you're building this application and this serverless architecture where it does have access to sensitive data, then that's what they should be segregated, right? They should not live in the same VPC. They should make sure that they're separate so that those serverless functions that typically get deployed in the same VPC, like you said, would have access to all of the resources if the correct security groups and correct deployment is not applied, right? Both with regards to the security groups, the network ACLs, and subnets.
Yeah, and another thing, right? As in certain organizations, right? Well, when you have a group writing Terraform code, it's not just that one group writing Terraform code. There will be several groups kind of contributing, and so this code base, which is about 100 lines, can grow to 5,000 lines, right, or 7,000 lines. So how does like the Oak9 CLI kind of keep track of that? And does it keep track of your design gaps and over time and give you an overall consensus on what your security architecture, what trend it's going towards?
Yeah, we can both keep track of the trends around how those design gaps are evolving, right? Because as you said, right, not only the code base can grow quickly, but it can change quickly. So what we can do is, because we are natively trying to understand Terraform, and what I mean by native is really what I'm saying is ultimately we're looking through all of your resources and its modules and where they're referenced from. So we're essentially building this connected component architecture under the hood, right? That gives us the ability to then say, hey, from this point in time, when you analyze this Terraform using Oak9 to the next time you analyze it, whether it's me or one of my teammates or someone else, then we can continuously understand how that architecture and that application is evolving and changing, right? And then that's how we're able to then give you feedback across what are the changes, how it's changing, and what are the impacts to both security and design, right? And one of the things that you can do is you can actually go right into, from here, if you wanted, go right into our console itself, right, to get a better understanding of, well, how does, these are the critical gaps, but if you wanted to and all the gaps that we've laid out here, but if you wanted a more detailed understanding of all the different resources that Oak9 looked at, what are some of the impact and other challenges that happen, then you can do that, right? So this is a project that we created. we went in, you'll notice that we identified bunch of resources that we picked up on. We will, same way we did earlier, right, on the CLI, we will tell you like what should be done to actually go fix it, not only what is wrong, right? Because that's just as important, right? Like I want actionable, accessible guidance, right? It's one thing to say, here's all the things you have done wrong, but then actually the next question is, well, how do I actually go fix it, right? What do I need to do? So we'll give you that feedback as well, Ramesh.
Nice.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the one thing I like to point out, right, is we focused a lot on the networking side, right? Network isolation. We talked about data encryption. Some of the things are relatively simple. Some of the configurations, depending on the features and services you're using, whether it's in AWS, Azure, or GCP, they can be a bit more complex, right? Around key management. Are you using the proper key management architecture? Because sometimes it's as simple as, yeah, turn my server-side DynamoDB encryption set to true, easy. But what if you have to deal with key management, right? That's a little bit more of a complicated use case as well.
Okay.
All right. So, I mean, I think we've talked a lot. We've showed an example of building the API. We talked about security and compliance. We talked about kind of the process, right? I think, the thing that was also mentioned, right, is, well, do we, what does Oak9 cost, or other open source tools are free, right? And, I'll come out and say it. We're a big advocate of supporting the community. We have a community edition that you can access for completely free. There's no credit card requirement. It's good for you to use forever for one application and a small team, entirely free. And you guys can go try it out. Hopefully some of you were asking about the repository, so you've been following along. But I would love to stop here and maybe pause to see if there are some more questions that we can help answer, or if there's anything else that is on people's mind.
So I think we answered most of the questions during the session. There isn't any new ones popping up.
All right, and let's look at our Q&A. Is anything there? Is it okay? So yeah, it sounds like some really good questions that were asked around kind of the what's out there and what the trends are, what are the other tools, and how we differentiate. And and we would love to hear more from you if you found this interesting, or if you have some more questions that you want to dig into, or you want us to cover that maybe we potentially didn't cover today. We are available. Ramesh and I will put in our contact info in the chat, and also you can always email us at hello@oak9.io. We're available, and if there are no questions, or then maybe I just have a few closing remarks, right? The one thing, as I mentioned, right, stay in touch with us. We're releasing a lot of updates. You can learn more about Oak9 from LinkedIn, Twitter, YouTube, TikTok. I think we're in every social media covered here. And the one thing I also wanted to mention is we're also engaging with security panel, with other tech leaders in the industry that are really focused on cloud infrastructure security, cloud security as a whole, with Security Boulevard. So stay tuned to hear more about that. That, I believe, is next month, right, Ramesh?
Yes, it is.
All right, awesome. And I think I'd remiss if I didn't mention that before you disconnect, please take our survey. It's 3 questions. It'll take 10 seconds. We want to understand and get some feedback on how did we do today. Was this helpful? Could we have been more technical, less technical? Give us some feedback. we'd love to hear from you. So I think that's it
Yeah.
from us. Cody, maybe
There's-
I'll hand it back to you.
Hey, before we hand it off to Cody, I'd like to answer that last question that came in. Sorry, Cody. Does Oak9 support GitLab server and GitLab.com? We do support GitLab. We do have an image that you can use in GitLab that allows you to run your run scans in your GitLab repo.
Awesome. Well, I'm going to go ahead and give away a couple of gift cards. So maybe anyone in the audience this is the last call for any questions you might have. These are for 4 $25 Amazon gift cards. Our first winner is Carrie M. Our second winner is Penny C. Our third winner is David S. And our fourth and final winner is Alvin F. So to our 4 winners, congratulations. Please keep an eye on your inbox. Keep an eye on your inbox to claim that gift card. But if you don't see that email, check your spam folder. And I'll also take this opportunity to remind everyone that this session was recorded. So following this program, you'll receive an email with a link to access that recording on demand, or you can find it living on the DevOps website at devops.com/webinars, and just be sure to look in the on-demand section. All right, so I'm just checking one last time to see if we received any questions. All right, I'm not seeing any more at this time. So Ramesh, thank you both so much for joining us today. Any final words before we close, or are you guys all wrapped up?
We're all wrapped up.
Thank you for having us.
Thanks for having us. It was a pleasure to be here, and it was fun talking to the audience. Some great questions. So that's it. We'll give people 9 minutes back.
Awesome. I love it. Well, thank you both. And I'd also like to thank Oak9 for sponsoring today's webinar. So Om and Ramesh also mentioned a survey. So their survey is very much the same survey that we are giving you. We've combined it for you to make it easy, and it will pop up on your screen as soon as we close out. So we would really appreciate if you took the time to fill out those couple questions. Other than that, to everyone who attended, we really appreciate you being here, and we hope to see you at an upcoming Techstrong Learning program. Everyone have a great rest of your day.
Thanks. Take care.